The small village of Fallerich had always been a quiet place. Tucked in the corner of the valley, surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills, it was a place that felt like it belonged to another time. The people there lived simple lives, with their days spent working the land and tending to their flocks. They were used to the rhythms of nature, to the quiet hum of the forest that surrounded them. But there was one person in the village who lived on the very edge of the forest, who kept to himself, who knew more about the woods than anyone else. His name was Jorin, the forest keeper. Jorin had been in Fallerich for as long as anyone could remember. Some said he was born in the forest, while others said he had come from a faraway place, drawn to the woods for reasons no one could understand. Either way, he was a mystery, someone who was both part of the village and yet separate from it, a figure shrouded in the kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable. He lived in a small cottage near the edge of the forest, a place so overgrown with ivy and moss that it was barely visible from the road. His garden, if you could call it that, was full of strange, wild plants, some of which the villagers had never seen before. There were tall trees that looked ancient, flowers that seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight, and vines that twisted in unnatural patterns. Some people in Fallerich spoke of the plants with awe, others with fear. The plants seemed to grow faster around Jorin's house, as if they were alive in a way that normal plants were not. Jorin himself was a tall man, with wild, tangled hair and a long, thick beard that matched the color of the forest's bark. His eyes were sharp and green, like the leaves in spring, but they had a strange depth to them, as though they had seen things that no one else could comprehend. He was a man of few words, preferring the company of the forest over people. When he spoke, it was always in riddles or quiet, cryptic sentences, as if he knew something the rest of the world didn't. The villagers had their suspicions about Jorin. They had heard rumors that he could talk to the trees, that he could summon the wind or calm a storm. They'd seen him disappear into the forest for days, only to return with strange plants or animals that seemed to have no place in the village. Some people claimed to have heard whispers in the wind when Jorin was near, like the trees themselves were speaking to him. But no one ever asked him about it directly. There was an unspoken understanding that the forest was his domain, and to question him was to risk something they couldn't understand. But one autumn evening, as the leaves turned from gold to crimson and the fog began to creep in from the hills, a young woman named Elira moved to Fallerich. She had come from the city, seeking peace after the loss of her family, seeking a place where she could heal. She had heard stories of the forest and the village, of the beauty that lay hidden beneath the wild woods. The idea of a quiet life, far from the noise and bustle of the city, had drawn her in like a moth to a flame. The villagers were kind to her at first, showing her the way around the village and pointing out the best places to gather herbs and firewood. But when they mentioned Jorin, the forest keeper, there was a note of hesitation in their voices. They didn't warn her to avoid him. He was, after all, a part of the village, but they didn't encourage her to seek him out either. Elira was curious, though. She had always been drawn to the natural world, to the quiet stillness of forests, and there was something about Jorin that intrigued her. She often found herself wandering near his cottage, gazing at the strange plants that grew in his garden or watching him from afar as he moved through the trees. He seemed to be in tune with the forest, as if he was part of it, one with the land. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Elira found herself at the edge of the forest once again, looking at Jorin's cottage. This time, something was different. There was a flickering light coming from inside, and Elira, feeling a pull she couldn't explain, found herself walking toward it. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the forest seemed alive with an energy she had never felt before. When she reached the cottage, she hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the soft murmur of voices from inside. It sounded like Jorin was talking to someone, or something. Elira had never heard him speak to anyone before, at least not in a way that was clear. She leaned closer, her curiosity getting the best of her, and pushed the door open just a crack. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single candle, its flickering flame casting long shadows on the walls. Jorin was standing by the hearth, a large pot bubbling over the fire, and beside him was a small wooden table covered in strange plants and dried herbs. But it wasn't the plants that caught Elira's attention, it was the figure seated at the table. It was a woman, or at least it looked like a woman, but her skin was pale and translucent, like she was made of mist. Her eyes were wide, the pupils an unnatural shade of silver, and her hair was long and flowing, made of what looked like liquid silver. She sat motionless, her hands folded delicately in her lap, her gaze fixed on Jorin as he moved around the room. Elira felt a shiver run down her spine. She had heard of spirits and creatures that dwelled in the woods, but she had never seen one before. She knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary visitor. This was something ancient, something that had walked the earth long before humans had ever arrived. Jorin's voice broke the silence. "She has come for her final rest," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "The forest calls her home." Elira stepped back, startled, her heart racing. She hadn't realized she had been holding her breath until she exhaled sharply. She turned to leave, but as she did, the woman's gaze shifted, locking onto hers. Elira froze, her feet rooted to the ground. The woman's voice was like the wind through the trees, soft and haunting. "You do not belong here." Elira swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She wanted to speak, to ask what was going on, but the words wouldn't come. She felt an overwhelming sense of fear, but also something else, a strange pull, like the forest itself was calling to her, asking her to stay. Before she could answer, Jorin appeared at her side, his presence grounding her. "It's time," he said quietly. "Come. I'll show you." Elira didn't know why, but she followed him. He led her deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the air grew colder. The sounds of the village faded, replaced by the soft murmur of the forest around her. The branches seemed to move with a life of their own, the leaves rustling like whispers in the wind. And the deeper they went, the more she felt as though the forest was watching her, waiting. At the heart of the woods, Jorin stopped. They were standing in front of a large, ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching out like twisted arms. The tree looked older than anything Elira had ever seen, its bark dark and scarred, its roots sprawling like veins beneath the earth. The air was thick here, heavy with something ancient. "This is the heart of the forest," Jorin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where the spirits rest. The forest has its own rhythm, its own pulse. And when it calls, the lost come home." Elira didn't understand. "The lost? What do you mean?" Jorin turned to face her, his eyes solemn. "The forest remembers. It holds the stories of those who have come before. The lost souls who wandered into its depths and were never seen again. But some of them return, their spirits bound to the land." He reached out, his hand brushing against the tree's bark. "This tree has seen more than you can imagine. It has witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the passage of centuries. And it keeps the memories, the stories of the lost." Elira's heart raced. She felt a deep sense of connection, of understanding. The forest had its own language, its own life. And somewhere deep within it, the spirits, those who had been lost to time, were waiting. Jorin's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're not just here by chance, Elira. The forest has called you." Before she could respond, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The ancient oak tree groaned, and a low, rumbling sound echoed through the woods. Elira turned to look, and for a brief moment, she could have sworn she saw shadows moving among the trees, figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Faces, eyes watching her. The wind howled, and the earth beneath her feet seemed to shift. And in that moment, Elira understood, the forest had been waiting for her all along. "Okay, we can do another one. A long time ago, there was a man named Darian who had wandered far into the forest. He wasn't from the village, he wasn't from anywhere really. He was a traveler, a man who had no real home, no family to return to. He was driven by something deep inside of him, something that made him wander from place to place, looking for something he couldn't name. It was in the forest, as he was passing through, that he first heard about the lost grove. The older people in the village had told him about it, the ones who spoke in hushed tones. They said it was a place no one should seek. They said it was a part of the forest that no man should enter. But Darien, being the curious sort, paid little mind to such warnings. He didn't believe in curses or warnings. He believed only in the path ahead, the road he could walk with his own 2 feet. The villagers spoke of the grove as if it were a place that existed outside of time, a place where things forgotten by the world lived. They said the grove was ancient, older than any human memory, and that it was full of trees that held secrets, secrets that should never be uncovered. One evening, as the fog began to settle over the forest, Darien found himself standing at the edge of the grove. He had walked for hours, guided only by the whispers of the wind and the faint smell of earth. The trees here were different from the others. They were larger, older, their bark black and twisted, their roots spreading out like fingers clawing at the earth. Their branches seemed to reach out, beckoning him in. He didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, past the threshold of the grove, and immediately felt the air change. The forest around him seemed to quiet, as though the trees were holding their breath, watching him. The path was narrow, winding through the trunks of the towering trees, and the fog clung to the ground like a heavy blanket, making it hard to see more than a few steps ahead. As Darien walked deeper into the grove, he noticed something strange. The trees, despite their imposing size, seemed to bend around him, guiding him forward, as if they were leading him somewhere. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on him, as though the trees were alive, watching his every move. And then he saw it, a single tree in the center of the grove. It stood taller than all the others, its bark dark and smooth, its leaves shimmering with a faint, otherworldly glow. The tree seemed to pulse with life, and when Darien stepped closer, he could feel something strange, a vibration in the air that seemed to come from the very heart of the tree itself. It was then that he heard it, a voice, soft and whispering, as if coming from the tree itself. The voice didn't speak words. It was a feeling, a pull, an invitation. He couldn't understand it, but he could feel it deep within him. The voice called to him, urging him to come closer, to touch the tree, to discover the secrets it held. Darien, without thinking, stepped forward and placed his hand on the tree's bark. The moment his fingers made contact, a rush of energy surged through him, and the ground beneath him trembled. The air around him grew thick, and the fog seemed to swirl in response to the tree's pulse. He felt a deep, ancient power coursing through the forest, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to blur, like the world itself was shifting, changing. And then, the path he had been following, the one that had led him to this tree, disappeared. The trees around him began to shift, their branches closing in, the fog thickening until it became impossible to see. He turned, trying to find his way back, but the grove seemed to stretch on, the trees twisting and changing, blocking his path. The tree, still pulsing with that strange energy, stood silent, as though watching him. The voice, that invisible presence, had gone quiet. The only sound now was the rustling of the trees, the whispering wind that seemed to speak in a language Darien couldn't understand. He took a step back, panic beginning to rise in his chest. The path was gone, and the grove had closed around him. The trees seemed to loom larger now, their trunks twisting in unnatural shapes, their branches reaching down like fingers. The forest had become alive, and it wasn't interested in letting him go. Darien turned again, but there was nothing but darkness ahead. The fog had thickened to the point where he could no longer see his hand in front of his face. His heart raced as the silence pressed in, and the trees around him began to groan, their limbs creaking as though they were waking up. He could feel their eyes on him, the ancient, unseen eyes of the forest, and he knew then that he had made a terrible mistake. The wind howled suddenly, loud and deafening, and the trees shook violently, their branches moving like limbs, as though they were alive. Darien stumbled, his mind racing for a way out, but every direction he turned only led him deeper into the maze of the grove. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift, as if the earth was swallowing him whole. Then, the ground cracked open beneath his feet. The sound was deafening, a deep, rumbling noise that echoed through the forest, and the earth split wide open. Darien fell, his legs giving way beneath him, and before he could scream, the ground closed up again, leaving him in darkness. He was trapped. In that instant, he realized that the forest had taken him. The lost grove, the place no one was meant to find, had claimed him. The trees, ancient and alive, had captured him, just as they had captured so many others before him. For days, or maybe weeks, Darien wandered, lost in the darkness of the grove. The trees whispered to him, their voices calling to him, but he could never make out their words. The fog never lifted, and the air never grew warmer. He stumbled through the twisting paths, the trees closing in on him with every step, and the voice, always there, always watching, followed him wherever he went. Eventually, he stopped trying to find his way out. The forest had him, and there was no escape. Years passed, but in the lost grove, time meant nothing. The trees were eternal, and so was the path. Darien wandered endlessly, his body growing weak, his mind slipping, but the forest never let go. And to this day, the path remains. The trees still watch, and the fog still swirls around the ancient trunks. The lost grove waits for those who wander too far, for those who seek what they should not. And once you step onto that path, there is no turning back. Okay, we can do another one. A long time ago, there was a man named Ezra. He was a traveler, a man with no true home, no place to belong. He wandered from place to place, moving through the world like a leaf carried on the wind. He didn't seek anything in particular, not happiness, not answers, just the open road and the feeling of going somewhere, even if that somewhere had no name. It was during one of these journeys that Ezra found himself deep within the forest. It was a place that wasn't like the others, darker, more ancient, a forest that seemed to stretch out endlessly, with trees so tall and thick that they blocked out the sun. It was quiet, unnervingly so. The kind of quiet that made Ezra feel as if he had stepped into a world forgotten by time. As he walked deeper into the woods, he came across an old, narrow path that cut through the trees. The earth beneath his feet was soft, covered in moss, and the air smelled of damp leaves and fresh pine. He didn't think much of it at first, but something about the path intrigued him. The trees seemed to part just enough to guide him forward, as if they were showing him the way. The fog started to roll in as the path grew narrower. It crept along the ground like a living thing, curling around the trunks of trees and weaving through the underbrush. The further he walked, the thicker the fog became, until it was hard to see more than a few feet in front of him. But Ezra pressed on, compelled by something he couldn't explain. After what felt like hours of walking through the fog, he stumbled upon a clearing. At the center stood a large stone, covered in moss and strange markings that Ezra couldn't recognize. It was an altar, of sorts, but ancient, older than anything he had ever seen. The stone was smooth, but there was a faint glow coming from the cracks in its surface, a soft, eerie light that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Ezra approached the stone cautiously, drawn to it as if it had been waiting for him. He ran his fingers over the markings, feeling an odd tingling sensation in his fingertips. The air around him seemed to grow colder, and the mist thickened, swirling around the stone like a fog of its own. As soon as his hand touched the stone, the ground beneath him trembled. The trees groaned, their trunks shifting and cracking as if they were alive. Ezra stepped back, his heart racing, but it was too late. The earth split beneath his feet, and the fog that had once surrounded him now closed in, thick and suffocating. Before he could move, the mist twisted, forming shapes, figures that appeared in and out of the fog, their forms blurry and indistinct. They didn't have clear faces, only hollow eyes that seemed to watch him from the darkness. They whispered to him, but the words didn't make sense. They were only feelings, emotions that cut into him, confusing his thoughts, making him dizzy. He turned to run, but the fog wrapped around him, pulling him toward the stone. The trees moved too, their branches reaching out like twisted arms, blocking his way. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and Ezra's heart beat faster with every step he took. No matter which direction he tried, he couldn't escape. The ground rumbled again, this time louder, deeper. The mist swirled around him, pulling him into the center of the clearing. The figures that had appeared in the fog gathered closer, moving in silent, undulating patterns. Their bodies shimmered in the pale light, their forms half hidden by the fog, and their eyes, those hollow eyes, stared at him with something that felt older than the world itself. And then, from the center of the mist, something began to emerge. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face was shrouded in shadow, its eyes glowing a dull yellow, the color of sickly light. The figure moved toward Ezra with an eerie, graceful slowness, its feet not quite touching the ground. "Who are you?" Ezra called out, his voice shaky, but the figure did not answer. It merely stepped closer, its body flickering in and out of existence like a mirage, like it was made of the fog itself. The whispers grew louder, now words, but still not words. They were feelings, impressions, swirling around him. They spoke of time, of paths that crossed and paths that were lost. Of roads that should not be taken, and the cost of stepping into places where the world's edges were thin. Ezra's legs felt heavy, as though the earth itself was holding him in place. He tried to step back, but his feet were glued to the ground. The mist twisted around him, thickening, suffocating, and the figure loomed closer, its face still hidden in shadow. "I found you," it said, its voice not one of sound, but of thought, vibrating in Ezra's mind. "The path was made for you. You've come, but you don't know why. The road has led you here, and it will take you." Ezra's breath quickened as the figure reached out, its long fingers brushing against his chest. It wasn't a physical touch, but a pressure, a coldness that seemed to reach into his very soul. The mist thickened around them, closing in from all sides, and the figures that had watched from the fog now surrounded him. The figure's voice echoed in his mind again, soft but insistent. "You've crossed the line. There is no going back." The earth trembled again, and suddenly, the fog pulled back. The stone in the clearing began to glow brighter, its light intensifying until it was blinding. The trees shifted, the ground cracking open, and the world around Ezra began to blur, the lines between what was real and what wasn't fading away. Ezra fell to his knees, his head spinning. The voices in his mind grew louder, the whispers of the fog, the memories of places he had never been. They filled him, consumed him, and when he looked up again, he saw the figure standing before him, the shadows receding from its face. For the first time, Ezra saw its eyes, yellow, glowing with an unnatural light, empty and endless. And in those eyes, he saw it, the hollow, the space where the world had cracked, the place where paths had been lost and forgotten. The figure spoke once more, its voice resonating in his mind. "You're not meant to leave. You never were. You've come to the hollow between worlds, and here, you will stay." The stone's light enveloped him, and the world spun faster, until it felt as though time itself had stopped. The trees, the fog, the figures, all were gone. And in their place, there was only the silence of a place that existed outside of time. Ezra was lost. The Whispering Hollow. "All right," the voice began, "let me tell you something else, but this one's different." It was late afternoon when Alex first found the path. He had been walking through the woods for hours, lost in thought, when he noticed a small trail that seemed to appear out of nowhere. At first, it looked like an animal's path, narrow and overgrown with brush. But as he followed it, the trees around him grew denser, the light dimming as though the very atmosphere had thickened. It wasn't the first time Alex had been in these woods, but something felt different this time. The air was still, unnaturally so, and there was a heaviness about it, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. The path twisted deeper into the forest, far from the usual trail he took when he ventured out for walks. It was quiet here, too quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the distant hum of insects. It was as though the world had quieted, leaving only the sound of his footsteps on the soft earth. After some time, the trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches intertwining like fingers, blocking out more and more of the sky above. The air felt cooler now, almost damp, and the path seemed to widen the further he walked. The trees here were ancient, with thick, gnarled roots and bark that looked as though it had been carved by time itself. As Alex walked, he noticed something strange. The ground seemed uneven, almost as if the earth had been disturbed, though he couldn't explain why. He stopped to catch his breath, noticing that the air had grown thick, heavier somehow. He looked around, half expecting someone to be watching him, but there was no one. Nothing but the trees, standing still in their eerie silence. But then, he saw it. A stone. Not just any stone, but an altar, placed at the very heart of the clearing. It wasn't large, about the size of a small table. But it looked ancient, covered in moss and ivy, its surface worn down by centuries of weather. The symbols etched into its surface were foreign to him, strange markings that seemed to pulse with some kind of energy. Curiosity pulled at him, and against his better judgment, Alex approached the stone. As he got closer, the feeling in the air grew more oppressive, like the space itself had shifted. The stone seemed to call to him, an unspoken invitation, and before he could stop himself, his hand reached out, brushing against the surface. The moment his fingers made contact, a low rumble echoed through the clearing. The earth trembled beneath him, and for a brief moment, the trees around him seemed to groan, their branches shaking as though they were alive. Alex stepped back, heart pounding. He looked around, but everything was still. The fog that had been creeping in seemed to disappear, leaving the space eerily quiet again. He felt uneasy, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, it did. The trees around him began to move. It started slowly at first, just a slight shift in the branches. But then it grew faster, the trees bending and twisting, their trunks creaking in the windless air. Alex's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively took a step back, his feet crunching on the leaves below him. That's when he saw them. Figures, dark and indistinct, appeared at the edge of the clearing. At first, he thought they were shadows, but they were too solid, too real. They were tall, with limbs stretched out in unnatural ways, their faces obscured by the thick mists that had begun to swirl around the base of the trees. They didn't speak, didn't move toward him. They just stood there, watching him with hollow, empty eyes. The silence stretched out, the tension in the air growing thick, suffocating. And then, one of them moved. It was slow at first, like it was wading through water. Its limbs bent unnaturally as it shuffled toward him. Alex's body froze, every muscle locked in place, his breath shallow. The figure didn't make a sound, but its eyes, those eyes, never left him. And then it whispered. It wasn't a voice he could hear, not with his ears. It was more like a thought, a presence that filled his mind. The words were unclear at first, but they became more distinct, more insistent. Come closer. The voice wasn't his own, but it felt like it was coming from inside his head. His heart pounded in his chest, his feet unwilling to move. Come closer. Don't be afraid. The figure took another step forward, and Alex's body finally obeyed. He stumbled backward, away from the stone, away from the figures that now surrounded him. But no matter which way he turned, there was no escape. The fog thickened around him, and the figures seemed to grow taller, looming over him, blocking his way. We are the forgotten. We are the lost. The words echoed through his mind, filling him with a sense of dread that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the earth itself. The air was thick now, suffocating, and the weight of the forest felt heavier, as if the trees were pressing in, closing the space around him. His mind raced. He had to get out. He had to leave before it was too late. But his legs wouldn't move. He was trapped, held in place by an invisible force that seemed to come from the stone itself. The figures continued to move toward him, their faces still hidden, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. And then, with a sudden jolt, the fog cleared. The figures disappeared, and the trees stopped moving. The clearing was still again, eerily so. But something had changed. Something had shifted. Alex's body was shaking. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing on him, pushing him to the ground. He couldn't explain it, but the forest had changed him. It had seen him, had marked him in some way. And he couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed into something he wasn't meant to find. He turned, taking one last look at the stone before running back down the path. The forest was silent now, the trees once again still, as though nothing had happened. But the feeling didn't leave him. The forest had claimed him, marked him, and he knew that no matter how far he ran, no matter how much he tried to escape, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows of his mind.